One freezing night, a young maid found a shivering stranger outside the old hotel. Without hesitation, she tore her only blanket in half and wrapped him in warmth. To her, he was just a drifter, lost, forgotten, and cold. But weeks later, the doors of that same hotel swung open, and in walked the stranger again, dressed in fine clothes, carrying deeds and fortune. The girl who once shared her blanket was now standing before the new owner. The wind screamed across the Wyoming plains like something wounded and furious, tearing through the empty miles with a hunger that swallowed sound itself. Snow fell sideways, thick and blinding, turning the world into a white fury where sky and earth became one. The stage road had vanished hours ago beneath drifts that rose like ocean waves frozen mid-crash. Nothing moved out there, nothing lived, except for one man. He rode bent low over his horse's neck, his coat torn open at the shoulder, ice crusting his beard and eyebrows. The animal beneath him stumbled, its breath coming in ragged clouds, legs trembling with exhaustion. He didn't pull the reins, didn't urge it forward. He simply held on, his grip weak, his body swaying with each unsteady step. Blood had frozen along his temple where someone had struck him days ago. He couldn't remember where, couldn't remember why. Only that he'd been riding, and now the cold had him. The horse stopped. He didn't notice at first. His eyes were half closed, frost clinging to his lashes. Then the animal's front legs buckled, and he felt himself sliding, the world tilting, the snow rushing up to meet him. He hit the ground hard, the impact jarring what little breath remained in his lungs. The horse collapsed beside him, steam rising from its heaving sides. He tried to move. Couldn't. The snow covered him in seconds, gentle and relentless, like a blanket being pulled over a child's sleeping form. His fingers curled once, then went still. The wind howled on, indifferent, eternal. And in the distance, barely visible through the storm, a single light flickered. Inside the staff quarters behind the Lone Briar Hotel, Clara Densmore knelt beside the dying fire, feeding it the last of the kindling. Her hands were raw, the skin cracked from endless scrubbing and washing, her knuckles red and swollen. She rubbed them together slowly, holding them near the flames, feeling the warmth seep into bones that never seemed to thaw completely. Outside, the storm battered the walls, rattling the shutters, shaking the thin glass in the windows. She'd stopped noticing it hours ago. Storms came every winter. They always passed. She was 32 years old and looked older. Her hair, once thick and dark, was pulled back tight under a fraying kerchief. Her dress was gray, patched at the elbows, the hem stained with soap and ash. She moved through the small room with the practiced efficiency of someone who had learned long ago not to waste motion. The fire, the water bucket, the narrow cot against the wall. This was her world, small, quiet, and hers alone. The hotel beyond the door was a different place entirely. Grand by frontier standards, with polished banisters and velvet curtains in the parlor, oil lamps that glowed warm through frosted windows. Travelers came through in summer, railway men, merchants, families heading west. In winter it was mostly empty, just her, the innkeeper, and the cook who barely spoke. Clara cleaned the rooms no one slept in, swept floors no one walked across, and waited for spring. She didn't mind the solitude. It was easier than the alternative. The fire popped, sending a small spray of embers onto the hearthstone. She brushed them away with the edge of her apron and stood, stretching her back. The wind howled louder, and she glanced toward the window. Snow pressed against the glass like a living thing, thick and unrelenting. She wondered if the stage would make it through tomorrow. Probably not. The roads were buried. Then she heard it, a sound beneath the storm, faint, almost imagined, the dull, heavy thud of something collapsing. Clara froze, her hand still on the mantel. She tilted her head, listening. The wind screamed. The shutters rattled. But there, beneath it all, a low, labored breath. The creak of leather, the soft, desperate whinny of a horse. Her heart kicked hard in her chest. She shouldn't go out there. She knew that. The storm was too fierce, the cold too deep. Whatever was out there could wait until morning. It probably wasn't even real, just the wind playing tricks, the way it always did on nights like this. But she moved anyway. She pulled her shawl from the hook by the door, wrapping it tight around her shoulders. Her fingers fumbled with the latch, stiff from cold and nerves. She pushed the door open, and the wind hit her like a fist, stealing her breath, whipping the shawl around her face. Snow stung her cheeks, her eyes. She squinted into the white chaos, one hand braced against the doorframe. "Hello?" Her voice was swallowed instantly. She stepped forward, boots sinking into the snow. The cold bit through her dress, her stockings, straight to the bone. She couldn't see more than a few feet ahead. Just white, just wind. Then she saw the shape. Dark against the snow. A mound half buried, steam rising faintly from its center. A horse, and beside it, a man. Clara's breath caught. She stumbled forward, her skirt dragging through the drifts, her shawl tangling around her arms. She dropped to her knees beside him, her hands hovering over his chest, unsure where to touch. His coat was frozen stiff, his face pale as the snow itself. Frost clung to his beard, his eyelashes. She pressed her fingers to his throat, searching for a pulse. There, faint, fluttering. But there, "Oh God," she whispered. She looked back toward the door, then down at him again. He was too heavy to carry, too far gone to wake. If she left him here to get help, he'd be dead before she made it back. So she didn't leave him. She hooked her arms under his shoulders and pulled. He didn't move. She dug her heels into the snow and pulled again, her muscles screaming, her breath coming in short gasps. Inch by inch, she dragged him toward the light. The snow fought her. The wind howled. Her shawl slipped loose, whipping into the storm. But she didn't stop. She pulled and pulled until the door was close enough to kick open with her boot. The warmth inside hit her like a wave. She hauled him across the threshold, his boots scraping over the wooden floor, and let him drop near the hearth. Her arms shook. Her lungs burned. She slammed the door shut and leaned against it, chest heaving, snow melting in her hair and down her neck. For a moment, she just stood there, staring at him. He didn't move, didn't make a sound. Clara shook herself and knelt beside him again. She pulled at his coat, peeling away the frozen layers. Beneath, his shirt was damp with sweat and melted snow, his skin cold to the touch. She grabbed the blanket from her cot, the only one she had, and spread it over him, tucking it around his shoulders, his legs. She fed more wood into the fire, coaxing the flames higher, then sat back on her heels, watching his face. He was young, maybe 30, strong-featured, with a scar along his jaw she hadn't noticed before. His breath came slow and shallow but steady. His lips were cracked, faintly blue. She didn't know who he was, didn't know where he'd come from or why he'd been out there. She didn't know if he was a drifter, a criminal, or just unlucky. But as she sat there in the firelight, watching the frost melt from his beard, she realized she didn't care. He was dying, and she'd pulled him back. The night stretched long and cold. Clara didn't sleep. She sat beside him, feeding the fire, adjusting the blanket when it slipped, pressing her hand to his forehead to check for fever. Once, near midnight, he stirred. His eyes cracked open, just a sliver, and he looked at her. She froze, her breath caught in her throat. His gaze was unfocused, distant, but for a moment she thought he saw her, really saw her. Then his eyes closed again and he was still. She stayed anyway. Outside, the storm raged on. Inside, the fire crackled softly, and the only sound was the slow, steady rhythm of his breathing. Clara pulled her knees to her chest, wrapping her arms around them, and watched the shadows dance across the walls. She thought about the life she'd built here, small, quiet, safe. She thought about the years she'd spent keeping her head down, her hands busy, her heart closed. She thought about the last time she'd done something just because it was right, without asking what it would cost her. She couldn't remember. But as the hours slipped past and the firelight warmed the room, she felt something shift inside her, something small and fragile, like the first crack in ice before the thaw. She didn't know his name, didn't know his story, but she'd shared her warmth with him, her blanket, her fire, her silent, stubborn refusal to let the cold win, and for the first time in a long time, that felt like enough. Dawn came slow and gray, the storm finally spent. The wind died to a whisper, and pale light filtered through the frosted windows, turning the snow outside into a soft, glowing sea. Clara blinked awake, her head resting against the edge of the hearth, her body stiff and aching. The fire had burned low. She sat up quickly, her gaze snapping to the spot where he'd lain. The blanket was folded neatly on the floor. He was gone. Clara stared at the empty space, her heart pounding in her chest. She stood, her legs unsteady, and crossed to the door. She pulled it open, stepping out into the cold morning air. The snow stretched out in every direction, pristine and untouched except for a single set of tracks leading away from the hotel. They disappeared over the rise, swallowed by the horizon. She stood there for a long time, the cold seeping through her dress, her breath misting in the air. He'd left. No words. No thanks. Just gone. She turned back inside, closing the door softly behind her. The blanket still lay by the fire, and she picked it up slowly, running her fingers over the worn wool. It smelled faintly of smoke and sweat and something else, something she couldn't name. She folded it carefully and tucked it under her cot. Outside, the snow-laden rooftops gleamed under the pale morning sun, and the world moved on, as it always did. But something had shifted, something small and quiet, buried deep beneath the surface. And Clara Densmore, who had learned long ago not to hope for anything, found herself wondering, just for a moment, if mercy could ever find its way back. The morning light came soft through the frost-laced windows, turning the hotel's main corridor into a tunnel of pale gold and shadow. Clara moved through it with her bucket and brush, her boots soundless on the polished floorboards, her movements automatic. Scrub, rinse, wring, move forward. She'd done this 1,000 times, maybe more. The rhythm steadied her, kept her hands busy when her mind wanted to wander back to the empty space by the hearth, the folded blanket, the tracks disappearing into nothing. She didn't look up when footsteps approached. "You hear about last night?" The voice belonged to Margaret, the cook's assistant, a round-faced woman in her 40s with sharp eyes and a sharper tongue. She stood at the top of the stairs, arms crossed, her apron dusted with flour. Clara kept scrubbing. "Hear what?" "Someone broke into the stables. Took nothing far as anyone can tell, but the door was wide open this morning, snow blown halfway to the back wall." Margaret descended a few steps, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial hiss. "Mr. Garrett thinks it was drifters. Says we're lucky they didn't try the main house." Clara's hand stilled for just a moment, the brush hovering over the wet floor. Then she resumed, her voice steady. "Maybe the wind blew it open." Margaret snorted. "In a storm like that?" Latch was lifted, Clara. "Someone was here. Then they're gone now. You don't seem concerned. Should I be?" Clara wrung out the brush and sat back on her heels, finally meeting Margaret's gaze. "If they took nothing and hurt no one, what's there to worry about?" Margaret studied her for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then she shook her head slowly. "You're a strange one, Clara Densmore. Always have been." She turned and climbed back up the stairs, muttering something under her breath about city girls and common sense. Clara waited until the footsteps faded, then let out a slow breath. She dipped the brush back into the bucket and kept working, but her hands were trembling now. She pressed them flat against the floor, willing them still. He'd been in the stables. That's where he'd gone when he left. Maybe to check on his horse, maybe just to disappear before anyone saw him. Either way, he was careful, quiet. The kind of man who knew how to leave without a trace, except he'd folded the blanket. That small detail sat heavy in her chest, warm and strange. By midday, the whispers had spread through the hotel like smoke through dry timber. Clara heard them in fragments as she moved from room to room. Voices drifting through open doors, hushed conversations that stopped when she entered. She kept her head down, her expression neutral, but the words clung to her anyway. Probably a deserter. Could have slit our throats. In our sleep. Heard he was bleeding. Margaret said there was blood on the stable floor. Lucky we weren't robbed blind. She was in the second floor hallway, changing the linens in one of the guest rooms, when Mr. Garrett found her. He was a tall man, lean and severe, with a salt and pepper beard trimmed close and eyes that never seemed to warm. He'd owned the Lone Briar for 15 years, and he ran it with the cold efficiency of someone who measured worth in dollars and reputation. Clara had worked for him for 6 of those years. He'd never once called her by her first name, Densmore. She turned, a pillowcase clutched in her hands. "Sir." He stood in the doorway, his arms behind his back, his posture rigid. "Were you in your quarters last night?" "Yes, sir. The entire night." She hesitated, just a fraction of a second. His eyes narrowed. "I stepped outside briefly," she said carefully, "to check the shutters. The wind was rattling them. Did you see anyone?" "No, sir." "Hear anything unusual?" "Just the storm." He watched her for a long moment, his jaw working slowly, as if chewing over her words. Then he stepped into the room, closing the door behind him. Clara's pulse quickened. "Margaret says you've been acting strange today," he said quietly. "Distracted. Nervous. I'm not nervous, sir, just tired. The storm kept me up." The storm. He moved closer, his boots heavy on the floorboards. You know what I think, Densmore? I think someone was here last night. I think they came through during the storm looking for shelter or something to steal, and I think you saw them. Clara's hands tightened on the pillowcase. I didn't see anyone. Then why do you look so frightened? I'm not. You're lying. His voice was low, almost gentle, but there was steel beneath it. I've employed you for 6 years, and you've never once given me trouble. Don't start now. If you know something, tell me. If someone was here, if you helped them, you need to speak up before this becomes a bigger problem. The air in the room felt too thick, too warm. Clara forced herself to meet his gaze, her heart hammering against her ribs. I didn't help anyone, she said quietly. I was alone all night. If someone was in the stables, I didn't see them. It wasn't entirely a lie. She hadn't seen him in the stables. She'd only seen him dying in the snow. Mr. Garrett held her gaze for another long moment, then stepped back, his expression unreadable. Fine. But if I find out you're protecting someone, harboring trouble, you'll be out of here before the day's end. Understood? Yes, sir. He turned and left, pulling the door shut behind him with more force than necessary. Clara stood alone in the silence, the pillowcase still clutched in her white-knuckled grip. Her legs felt weak. She sank down onto the edge of the bed, pressing her hands to her face, trying to steady her breathing. Harboring trouble. Was that what she'd done? She thought about the man's face in the firelight, the way his breath had rattled in his chest, the frost clinging to his beard. If she'd left him out there, he'd be dead. Frozen solid by morning, buried under snow until spring thaw. But she hadn't left him, and now the whole hotel was whispering. The afternoon dragged on, cold and gray. The storm had passed, but heavy clouds still hung low over the plains, and the air smelled of snow yet to come. Clara worked in silence, moving through her tasks with mechanical precision. Sweep, dust, polish, empty the chamber pots, haul the water, stoke the fires. Her body ached, but she welcomed the exhaustion. It left less room for thinking. By evening, the whispers had shifted. Maybe it was a bounty man. Heard there's outlaws hiding in the hills. Could be that gang from Laramie, the ones who hit the payroll coach. Clara listened without meaning to, her hands moving automatically as she scrubbed the parlor floor. The guests who'd been stranded by the storm had gathered near the fireplace, a merchant and his wife, a traveling preacher, 2 railway men, and they spoke in low, serious tones, their faces grave. I'm telling you, the merchant said, leaning forward in his chair, this territory's crawling with trouble. Law can't keep up. A man's not safe on the roads anymore. Maybe he wasn't running, the preacher said quietly. Maybe he was just lost. Lost men don't sneak into stables at night, one of the railway men countered. Lost men knock on the front door, unless they're wanted, the merchant's wife added, her voice barely above a whisper. Then they hide. Clara kept her head down, her brush moving in slow circles. She felt their eyes on her occasionally, curious, suspicious, but no one spoke to her directly. She was part of the furniture here, invisible unless needed. It was easier that way. She finished the floor and carried her bucket toward the back hallway, but as she passed the staircase, she heard Mr. Garrett's voice drifting down from his office above. Don't care what you think you saw, Margaret. I'm not calling the sheriff over a blown open door. But what if he comes back? What if... He won't. Men like that don't come back. They take what they need and move on. Clara paused at the bottom of the stairs, her hand on the banister. Men like that, as if Mr. Garrett knew, as if anyone here knew anything about the stranger except that he'd been desperate enough to ride through a blizzard and lucky enough to survive it. She thought about the folded blanket again, the care in that small gesture. Men like that didn't fold blankets. Night came early in winter, the darkness swallowing the plains long before supper was served. Clara took her meal alone in the staff quarters, as she always did. A bowl of thin stew and a piece of hard bread. She ate slowly, staring into the fire, her mind far away. When she was finished, she washed her bowl and set it on the shelf, then crossed to her cot. She knelt down and pulled the blanket out from beneath it, unfolding it slowly. It was wool, faded and worn, with a patch near one corner where she'd mended it years ago. Nothing special, just a blanket. But it had been enough. She held it in her lap, running her fingers over the rough weave, and for the first time all day, she let herself think about him. Really think about him. The weight of his body as she dragged him through the snow. The shallow rise and fall of his chest. The way his eyes had opened, just for a second, and looked at her. Who was he? Where had he come from, and why did it matter? She folded the blanket again slowly and tucked it back under the cot. Then she lay down, pulling her thin quilt over herself, and stared at the ceiling. Outside, the wind began to pick up again, rattling the shutters, whistling through the cracks in the walls. It sounded lonely, mournful, like something searching. Clara closed her eyes, but sleep was slow to come. And when it finally did, she dreamed of tracks in the snow, leading nowhere. 3 days passed. The storm's remnants melted under pale sunlight, turning the roads to mud and the plains to a patchwork of white and brown. The stage came through again, bringing new guests and taking the old ones away. Life at the Lone Briar returned to its usual rhythm. Quiet, cold, predictable. But the whispers didn't stop. They lingered in the corners of rooms, in the spaces between words. Clara heard them when she served tea in the parlor, when she passed Margaret in the kitchen, when she crossed paths with Mr. Garrett in the hallway. No one accused her directly, no one demanded answers. But the suspicion hung in the air like smoke, and she felt it pressing down on her shoulders, heavier each day. She stopped eating in the main kitchen, stopped making small talk with the other staff. She came and went like a ghost, doing her work and disappearing back into her quarters before anyone could corner her. It was easier that way. On the third night, she couldn't sleep. The wind had picked up again, not as fierce as before, but steady and cold. She lay in her cot, staring at the dark ceiling, listening to the creak of the walls and the distant howl beyond them. Finally, she rose and pulled her shawl around her shoulders. She lit a candle and carried it to the small window, pressing her forehead against the cold glass. Outside, the plain stretched away into darkness, empty and endless. She thought about the stranger, wondered where he was now, if he'd made it to wherever he was going, if he even remembered the night she'd pulled him from the snow. Probably not. It had been a small thing, really. A moment. One person helping another because it was the right thing to do. He didn't owe her anything. She didn't expect anything. But still, she stayed at the window for a long time, the candlelight flickering against the glass, her breath fogging the pane. And when she finally turned back to her cot, she noticed something. Near the door, half hidden in shadow, lay a small object she hadn't seen before. Clara crossed the room slowly, the candle held high. She knelt down and picked it up, her heart suddenly loud in her ears. It was a revolver, old, worn, the metal dark with age and use. The handle was wrapped in cracked leather, and there were scratches along the barrel, marks of a hard life, hard use. She turned it over in her hands, her pulse racing. He'd left it, not in the stables, not outside, here, in her room, which meant he'd come back. Sometime in the last 3 days, while she'd been working or sleeping, he'd slipped inside and left this behind. Proof, evidence, a message she couldn't quite read. Clara stared at the revolver for a long moment, her mind spinning. Then she wrapped it carefully in a piece of cloth and hid it at the bottom of her trunk beneath her spare dress and winter stockings. No one could know. Not Mr. Garrett, not Margaret, no one. She blew out the candle and climbed back into bed, pulling the quilt up to her chin. But she didn't close her eyes. She lay there in the darkness, listening to the wind, her heart still racing. He'd come back, and for reasons she couldn't explain, that changed everything. By morning, the drizzle had returned, light and cold, turning the world gray and soft. Clara moved through her chores in a daze, her thoughts circling back again and again to the revolver hidden in her trunk. She scrubbed floors she'd scrubbed the day before, dusted shelves that weren't dusty, tried to lose herself in the work. It didn't help. At midday, she was hanging linens in the backyard when she heard boots crunching through the wet snow behind her. She turned, expecting Margaret or one of the railway men. It was Mr. Garrett. He stopped a few feet away, his hands in his coat pockets, his expression unreadable. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The drizzle fell soft between them, and somewhere in the distance, a crow cawed. "Owe you an apology, Densmore," he said finally. Clara blinked. "Sir, I was harsh the other day. I let the situation get the better of me." He shifted his weight, uncomfortable. "You've been a good worker, reliable. I shouldn't have questioned your integrity." She didn't know what to say. Mr. Garrett never apologized. "I understand, sir," she said quietly. He nodded, then glanced toward the horizon, his jaw tight. "This territory makes men paranoid. We hear stories, robberies, killings, men hanged for crimes they didn't commit, and we start seeing danger in every shadow." He looked back at her. "But that's no excuse. You didn't deserve my suspicion." Clara's chest tightened. She thought about the revolver, the folded blanket, the stranger's face in the firelight. "I appreciate that, sir," she said. He nodded again, then turned and walked back toward the hotel, his shoulders hunched against the drizzle. Clara watched him go, her hands gripping the wet linen. Guilt twisted inside her, sharp and cold. She was lying to him, to all of them, and she didn't know if that made her brave or just foolish. The days blurred together after that. Winter settled in fully, the cold deepening, the night stretching longer. The hotel grew quiet, nearly empty except for the permanent staff. Clara worked alone more often than not, and the solitude should have felt familiar, but it didn't. She found herself pausing in doorways, glancing out windows, listening for sounds that weren't there. At night, she lay awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering if he'd come back again, if he'd knock this time, if she'd open the door. She never heard him. But the revolver stayed hidden in her trunk, and she checked on it every night before bed, proof that she hadn't imagined any of it. Proof that mercy, once given, leaves marks neither time nor distance can erase. Spring came slowly to Wyoming, but by late February, the first signs appeared, patches of brown earth showing through the snow, icicles dripping from the eaves, the faint smell of thaw in the air. And with it, the whispers finally faded. The town returned to its cold, steady rhythm. The stranger became a story people told when the fire burned low, half rumor, half myth. A ghost who'd passed through and vanished, nothing more. Clara folded her life back into its familiar shape, small, quiet, safe. But at night, when the wind moved through the plains and the firelight danced on the walls, she thought about the man in the snow, the weight of him, the stillness, the way he'd looked at her for just a second like he was trying to remember something he'd forgotten, and she wondered, in the deep, secret places of her heart, if she'd ever see him again. The blanket lay folded beneath her cot, the revolver stayed hidden, and the world moved on, as it always did, but something had changed, something she couldn't name, couldn't hold, couldn't shake. A space had opened inside her, small and quiet, where hope had once been, and though the snow melted and the plains turned green and the hotel filled again with travelers heading west, that space refused to close. It waited, patient, still, like winter itself, holding its breath before the storm. The first wildflowers appeared in mid-April, pale and stubborn, pushing through the last patches of snow like small fists breaking through ice. Clara found them while hanging laundry behind the staff quarters, delicate blooms the color of cream and butter, their petals trembling in the morning breeze. She knelt down, her hands still damp from the wash basin, and touched one gently with her fingertip. Spring had come. She could feel it in the air, warmer now, softer, carrying the smell of wet earth and new grass. The plains stretched away in every direction, no longer white and barren but rolling green and gold, dotted with sage and scrub pine. The sky seemed wider somehow, bluer, as if winter had been holding it down and finally let go. Clara stood slowly, brushing dirt from her skirt, and looked toward the horizon. The stage road was visible now, a thin brown line cutting through the grassland, and she could see dust rising in the distance where wagons moved. Travelers would be coming through again soon. Merchants, families, railwaymen heading west to lay track. The hotel would fill with voices and footsteps, the smell of coffee and tobacco, the clatter of dishes and boots on wood. She should have felt relief. Winter was the hard season, cold and lonely and long. Spring meant work, yes, but it also meant life, movement, the world waking up. But as she stood there watching the dust rise on the distant road, all she felt was a strange, hollow ache. He was gone, truly gone. The winter had kept her hope alive somehow. The silence and snow had made it seem possible that he might return, that he'd walk through the storm again, knock on her door, say something that explained it all. But spring was here now, and the roads were open, and if he'd wanted to come back, he would have. Clara picked up the laundry basket and carried it inside, her movements automatic. She hung the damp linens on the line strung across the corner of her room, then washed her hands in the basin and dried them on her apron. The revolver was still hidden in her trunk. She hadn't touched it in weeks. Part of her wanted to take it out, hold it, remind herself that it had been real, but she didn't. Instead, she tied her kerchief tighter and stepped out into the hallway, ready to begin another day. By May, the Lone Briar Hotel was alive again. The guest rooms filled one by one, a doctor traveling to Cheyenne, a pair of surveyors mapping land for the railroad, a widow and her 2 daughters moving west to join family. Clara moved through the days in a steady rhythm, her hands always busy, scrubbing floors, changing linens, polishing brass fixtures until they gleamed, carrying trays of tea and coffee to the parlor where guests sat by the windows and talked about weather, crops, the price of land. She listened without meaning to, catching fragments of conversation as she worked, heard their laying track all the way to Laramie by fall. Land's cheap now, but it won't be for long. Fellow came through last week offering top dollar for property near the depot. The talk was always the same: money, expansion, opportunity. The West was opening up and men with ambition were rushing in to claim their piece of it. Clara had heard it all before. Every spring brought the same fever, the belief that this year, this place, would be the one where fortunes were made. She didn't believe it, not for herself anyway. Her world was small, and she'd made peace with that long ago. She had a room, a job, enough to eat. That was more than many could say. Hope was a luxury she couldn't afford. Still, on warm afternoons when the sunlight slanted through the tall windows and turned the parlor golden, she found herself pausing in doorways, watching the guests with something close to longing. They had places to go, people waiting for them, lives that stretched forward, full of possibility. Clara had only this, and most days it was enough. One evening in late May, she was serving tea in the parlor when she overheard a conversation that made her hands still on the tray. 2 men sat near the fireplace, one older, gray-haired and heavy-set, the other younger, lean and sharp-eyed. They spoke in low voices, but the room was quiet, and sound carried. "I'm telling you, Whitmore, this town's about to change," the younger man said. "The railroad's coming through. Property values will triple in a year." The older man, Whitmore, leaned back in his chair, swirling whiskey in a glass. "And you think the hotel's worth buying? Not just the hotel, the land around it, the stables, the whole block. Whoever owns this place owns the center of town." The younger man leaned forward, his voice dropping. "I've heard rumors there's a buyer. Serious money. Someone with connections back east." Whitmore frowned. "Garrett won't sell. He's stubborn as a mule. Everyone sells eventually, just a matter of price." Clara set the teapot down carefully on the side table and slipped out of the room, her heart beating a little faster. She didn't know why the conversation unsettled her. The hotel had been sold before, twice that she knew of. Ownership changed. Life went on. It didn't affect her. But still, she thought about the stranger's revolver hidden in her trunk, thought about the way he'd appeared and vanished like smoke. And she wondered, just for a moment, if there were forces moving through this town that she couldn't see, currents pulling everyone toward something she didn't yet understand. She shook the thought away and went back to work. Summer arrived slowly, warm and golden, the days stretching long and lazy. The plains turned the color of wheat and honey, and the air smelled of dust and wild sage. Clara rose before dawn each morning, when the world was still cool and quiet, and worked until the light faded. Her hands grew harder, her back stronger. She moved through the hotel like a shadow, efficient and invisible, but something had shifted inside her. She couldn't name it, couldn't point to a moment when it happened, but she noticed it in small ways, the way her gaze drifted toward the windows more often, searching the road for riders, the way her heart quickened when the front door opened and boots sounded on the floorboards, the way she paused sometimes in the middle of a task, her hands still, her mind somewhere far away. She was waiting. For what, she didn't know. But the waiting had become part of her, woven into the fabric of her days like thread through cloth. One afternoon in early June, Clara was in the laundry room, wrestling with a heap of soiled linens, when Margaret appeared in the doorway. "You hear the news?" Margaret asked, her arms crossed, her expression sour. Clara looked up, a damp sheet clutched in her hands. "What news?" "There's a buyer for the hotel." Clara's hands stilled. "Mr. Garrett selling?" "Not yet, but he's considering it. Man came through yesterday. Fancy coat, polished boots, talked like he'd swallowed a dictionary. Made Garrett an offer he can't refuse from what I heard." Clara turned back to the laundry, her pulse quickening. "Did you see him? The buyer?" "No. He met with Garrett in the office, private-like. But I heard the manager at the Mercantile talking. Said the man's been buying up property all over town. Got money to burn, apparently. Clara wrung out the sheet mechanically, her mind spinning. What happens to us? If he sells? Margaret shrugged. Who knows? New owners might keep us on. Might bring their own people. Either way, nothing's certain anymore. She left without waiting for a response, her footsteps echoing down the hall. Clara stood alone in the laundry room, steam rising around her, her hands trembling slightly. Change was coming. She could feel it now, pressing in from all sides. The life she'd built here, small and quiet and hers, was slipping through her fingers like water. She thought about leaving, finding work somewhere else, another hotel, another town. But the thought exhausted her. She'd been running her whole life, running from cities, from memories, from people who asked too many questions. She'd found a kind of peace here, even if it was lonely. She didn't want to run again, but she didn't know how to stay either. The days blurred together after that, each one bleeding into the next. Clara worked, ate, slept, watched the road, waited. In early July, the heat became oppressive, thick and heavy, pressing down on the plains like a hand. The hotel grew sluggish, the guests moving slowly through the halls, the air inside stale despite open windows. Clara hauled water from the well more times than she could count, her arms aching, her dress soaked through with sweat. One evening, as the sun dipped low and turned the sky the color of fire, she sat on the back steps with a cup of cool water, watching the light fade. The plains stretched away in every direction, gold and endless, and somewhere in the distance, a hawk circled lazily against the orange sky. She thought about the stranger, wondered if he ever thought about her, if he remembered the night she'd pulled him from the snow, wrapped him in her blanket, kept watch while he slept. Probably not. It had been nothing to him, a moment, a kindness forgotten as soon as the sun rose. But to her, she didn't finish the thought, just sipped her water and watched the sky darken. On a warm morning in late July, Clara was polishing the brass fixtures in the main hallway when she heard voices near the front desk. She glanced up, her hand still on the banister, and saw Mr. Garrett speaking with a man she didn't recognize. The stranger wore a dark coat despite the heat, his hat pulled low, his posture straight and formal. He spoke quietly, his words too low for Clara to hear, but Mr. Garrett nodded, his expression serious. Clara turned back to her work, but she kept glancing over her shoulder, curiosity prickling at the edges of her mind. After a few minutes, the man left, and Mr. Garrett stood alone at the desk, staring down at a piece of paper in his hands. His face was pale, his jaw tight. Clara set down her polishing cloth and approached slowly. "Sir, is everything all right?" He looked up, startled, then quickly folded the paper and tucked it into his vest pocket. "Fine, Densmore. Just business. Is it about the sale?" His eyes narrowed slightly. "You've been listening to gossip," Margaret mentioned. "Margaret talks too much." He sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. "Yes. It's about the sale. The buyer's made his final offer. I have until the end of the month to decide." Clara's chest tightened. "And will you sell?" He didn't answer right away, just looked past her, toward the tall windows where sunlight poured through, warming the polished floors, the velvet chairs, the oil paintings on the walls. This place was his life. 15 years he'd poured into it. "I don't know," he said finally. "The money's good, more than good. But," he shook his head, "it doesn't matter. Business is business." Clara wanted to say something, wanted to tell him that it did matter, that places like this held more than just value. They held memory, history, the quiet weight of all the lives that had passed through. But she didn't. She just nodded and went back to her polishing, and Mr. Garrett stood alone at the desk, staring at nothing. August came, thick and golden. The plains shimmered with heat, and the air smelled of dry grass and dust. Clara moved through her days like a sleepwalker, her body present, her mind elsewhere. One afternoon she was in the guest wing, stripping linens from an empty room, when she found something tucked between the mattress and the bed frame. A blanket, her blanket. She pulled it out slowly, her heart pounding. It was the same one. She recognized the patch, the worn edges, the faint smell of smoke still clinging to the wool, but it had been laundered, carefully folded, returned. Clara sank down onto the edge of the bed, the blanket clutched in her hands. She looked around the empty room, her breath shallow. No one had stayed here in weeks. She'd cleaned it herself just 2 days ago, which meant someone had been here, recently. She stood quickly, crossing to the window. The street below was quiet, just a few townsfolk moving slowly through the heat. No strangers, no riders, nothing out of place. But her hands were shaking. She folded the blanket again, holding it close, and carried it back to her quarters. She didn't hide it this time. She laid it across the foot of her cot, smoothing out the creases, and sat down beside it. Sunlight streamed through the small window, warm on her face. And for the first time in months, Clara allowed herself to smile. Not because she understood, not because she had answers, but because someone, somewhere, had remembered. And that small, stubborn kindness was enough to make the waiting feel less like loneliness and more like faith. The days shortened as autumn crept closer. The heat began to break, and cool mornings returned, the air crisp and clean. The hotel bustled with late-season travelers, and Clara worked harder than ever, her hands always busy. But now, when she paused in doorways or stood at windows, she wasn't searching anymore. She was listening, to the wind moving through the eaves, to the creak of the floorboards, to the sound of boots on the porch steps. Waiting, yes, but no longer afraid, because the blanket had come back, and so, she believed, would he. The plains rolled on, golden and endless, beneath a sky so wide it seemed to hold the whole world. And somewhere, beyond the horizon, beyond the dust and distance, someone was riding, closer, always closer, until the day the wind would shift, and everything she thought she knew about mercy and kindness and the quiet architecture of fate would change forever. But for now, she simply waited, and the world, patient and unhurried, waited with her. The dust rose in a slow cloud down the main street, golden in the late morning sun. Clara saw it first from the second-floor window where she was shaking out a rug, a plume lifting against the blue sky, moving steady and deliberate. She paused, the rug hanging over the sill, and watched as the shape beneath the dust resolved into something solid. A carriage, not the stage, which rattled through twice a week with mud-splattered sides and weary horses. This was different, black lacquered wood gleaming even through the dust, brass fittings catching the light. Two matched horses, dark as coal, their heads high and proud. The kind of carriage that belonged in cities, not on the wind-scraped plains of Wyoming. Clara set the rug aside and leaned closer to the glass, her breath fogging the pain. The carriage slowed as it approached the hotel, then stopped directly in front. For a long moment, nothing happened. The horses stood perfectly still, their sides barely moving. The driver sat rigid on his bench, his face shadowed beneath a wide-brimmed hat. Then the door opened. A man stepped out. He wore black, a tailored coat that fit his shoulders like it had been made for him, a vest the color of gunmetal, trousers pressed sharp as knife edges. His boots were polished to a mirror shine despite the dust. He moved with the kind of ease that came from certainty, from knowing exactly where he belonged and never questioning it. His hat was dark, the brim low, casting his face in shadow, but Clara saw his eyes, and her heart stopped. She knew those eyes. Had seen them once, half open, unfocused, staring at her through firelight and fever. Had wondered for months if she'd imagined them. Had dreamed about them in the cold hours before dawn when the world felt too big and too empty. It was him, the stranger from the snow. Her hand went to her throat, pressing against the sudden wild hammering of her pulse. She watched as he turned slowly, surveying the street, the hotel, the wide empty sky above. He said something to the driver, too quiet to hear, and the man nodded and climbed down, moving to retrieve luggage from the back of the carriage. The stranger, no, not a stranger anymore, something else, something she didn't have a word for, walked toward the hotel entrance. His stride was measured, confident. He didn't look up, didn't glance at the windows where Clara stood frozen, her knuckles white against the sill. He simply walked inside, and the door closed behind him. Clara stumbled back from the window, her legs unsteady. Her mind raced, thoughts tumbling over each other too fast to catch. It was him. It had to be. But he looked so different. No torn coat, no frost in his beard, no blood on his temple. He looked like money, like power, like someone who owned things instead of running from them. Why was he here? She pressed her hands to her face, trying to steady her breathing. Maybe she was wrong. Maybe it was someone else. Just a man with similar eyes, similar features. The storm had been months ago. Memory played tricks. She could be mistaken. But the blanket, the revolver, the way her heart had recognized him before her mind even caught up, she wasn't mistaken. Clara grabbed the rug and hurried down the back stairs, her boots loud on the wood. She needed to see him up close, needed to know for certain. She moved through the narrow hallway toward the main entrance, her pulse still racing, her hands trembling. When she reached the lobby, she stopped in the doorway, half hidden in shadow. Mr. Garrett stood behind the front desk, his posture stiff, his expression carefully neutral. The stranger stood opposite, one hand resting lightly on the polished wood, the other holding a leather document case. Between them, papers were spread across the desk, official-looking, stamped with seals and signatures. "Reviewed the terms," the stranger was saying, his voice low and even. "Everything's in order. The deed transfers upon signature." Mr. Garrett's jaw worked slowly. "You're certain about this? The amount?" "I don't make offers I'm not certain about." "It's generous. More than generous. It's fair." The stranger's tone didn't change, still calm, still measured. "You've built something solid here. I respect that. But the town's changing. The railroad's coming. You can take this offer and retire comfortably, or you can wait and see what happens when the tracks arrive and property values shift." He paused. "Your choice." Mr. Garrett stared down at the papers, his fingers drumming once, twice against the desk. Then he picked up a pen, dipped it in ink, and signed. The scratch of the nib against paper seemed impossibly loud. Clara's breath caught. The stranger straightened, gathering the papers with practiced efficiency. "I'll have my attorney file these by week's end. You'll have the full amount wired to your account within 3 days. And the staff?" Mr. Garrett's voice was quieter now, uncertain. "What happens to them? They stay, unless they choose otherwise." The stranger tucked the papers into his case and snapped it shut. "I'm not interested in disruption, just ownership." Mr. Garrett nodded slowly, then extended his hand. The stranger took it, and they shook, brief, formal. Then Mr. Garrett reached into his vest pocket and pulled out a set of keys. He set them on the desk between them. "The Lone Briar's yours, then." The stranger picked up the keys, weighing them in his palm for a moment. Then he nodded. "I'll take the East Suite. Have someone bring my things up." "Of course, I'll—" Mr. Garrett turned, scanning the empty lobby, and his gaze landed on Clara Densmore. "Come here." Clara's heart lurched. She stepped forward, her hands clasped in front of her apron, her eyes fixed carefully on the floor. She could feel the weight of the stranger's gaze as she approached, heavy and unreadable. "This is Clara Densmore," Mr. Garrett said. "She's been with us 6 years. Reliable, hard-working. She'll see to your rooms." "Thank you." The stranger's voice was directed at Mr. Garrett, not her. "That'll be all, Mr. Garrett hesitated, then nodded and stepped away, disappearing into the back office. The sound of the door closing echoed through the lobby, and then it was just the two of them. Clara stood perfectly still, her eyes still downcast, her pulse roaring in her ears. The silence stretched, thick and heavy. She could hear the ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner, the faint creak of the floorboards as he shifted his weight, the sound of her own breathing, too loud, too fast. "Look at me." The words were quiet, not a command exactly, but not a request either. Clara lifted her gaze slowly. His face was older than she remembered, or maybe she'd just never really seen it before. Sharp-featured, with a strong jaw and a mouth that looked like it didn't smile often. The scar she'd noticed that night was still there, a thin line running along his cheekbone. His hair was dark, combed back, streaked faintly with gray at the temples. And his eyes, God, his eyes. They were the same, dark and steady and impossible to read. But there was something else there now, something she couldn't name. Not warmth exactly, not recognition, just awareness. It was looking at her the way someone looks at a painting they've seen before but can't quite place. "What's your name?" he asked. Her throat tightened. "Clara, sir. Clara Densmore. How long have you worked here, Clara?" 6 years, sir." He nodded slowly, his gaze never leaving hers. "And in those 6 years, have you ever done anything you weren't supposed to?" The question landed like a stone in still water. Clara's hands tightened in her apron. "Sir?" "Harbored someone. Helped someone you shouldn't have. Kept secrets." Her pulse thundered. She didn't know how to answer. Didn't know if he was testing her or accusing her or something else entirely. So she did the only thing she could. She told the truth. "Once," she said quietly. His expression didn't change. Why? Because he was dying. The silence that followed felt like the moment before lightning strikes. Charged, inevitable. Then, slowly, the stranger's mouth curved. Not a smile. Not quite. But something softer than the stone mask he'd worn since stepping out of the carriage. I see. He stepped back, adjusting the document case under his arm. My luggage is outside. Have it brought to the East Suite. I'll need fresh linens, hot water, and supper at 7. Can you manage that? Yes, sir. Good. He turned toward the stairs, then paused, glancing back over his shoulder. And Clara, sir, thank you for your honesty. Then he climbed the stairs, his boots heavy on the wood, and disappeared down the second-floor hallway. Clara stood alone in the lobby, her legs shaking, her breath coming in shallow gasps. He knew. He'd known the whole time. And he'd said nothing. The rest of the day passed in a blur. Clara moved through her tasks mechanically, her mind spinning. She carried his luggage upstairs, 2 leather cases and a traveling trunk, all stamped with initials she didn't recognize. She changed the linens in the East Suite, drawing the curtains, lighting the lamps. She hauled hot water from the kitchen and filled the wash basin, her arms aching. And through it all, she didn't see him again. He'd closed the door to the suite and stayed inside, and the hallway remained silent except for the creak of old wood settling. By evening, the news had spread through the hotel like wildfire. Bought the whole place outright. Paying Garrett more than it's worth from what I heard. Heard he's got holdings in Denver, maybe even back east. Wonder what he wants with a place like this. Clara listened to the whispers as she set the table in the small private dining room adjacent to the main parlor. She placed the silverware with shaking hands, smoothed the tablecloth, checked the napkins twice. At precisely 7 o'clock, she knocked on the door of the East Suite. Come in. She opened the door slowly. He was standing by the window, his coat removed, his shirt sleeves rolled to the elbows. The lamplight caught the edges of his profile, turning him into something between shadow and substance. He didn't turn when she entered. Your supper's ready, sir, Clara said quietly. Bring it here. She hesitated. Here, sir? I prefer to eat alone. You can set it by the desk. Clara nodded and retreated, returning a few minutes later with a tray. Roasted chicken, potatoes, bread still warm from the oven. She set it down carefully, her hands steady despite the wild hammering of her heart. Will there be anything else, sir? Yes. He turned finally, leaning against the window frame, his arms crossed. Sit down. Clara froze. Sir, I... Sit. She glanced toward the chair by the desk, then back at him. Slowly, carefully, she sat, her back straight, her hands folded in her lap. He studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Do you know who I am? He asked. No, sir. My name is Daniel Ashford. I own 4 hotels, 2 freight companies, and enough land to make most men in this territory jealous. He paused. 5 months ago, I was worth nothing. Less than nothing. I was a man with a price on his head, half dead in a blizzard, with no reason to believe I'd see morning. Clara's throat tightened. Someone pulled me out of that storm, he continued, his voice quiet now, almost gentle. Gave me shelter, warmth, asked for nothing in return. And when I woke up, I didn't know her name, didn't know if she was real or just a fever dream. He took a step closer, but I remembered her hands, the way they shook when she wrapped the blanket around me, the way she sat beside me all night, feeding the fire, making sure I kept breathing. Tears pricked at the corners of Clara's eyes. She blinked them back. I spent months trying to find her, Daniel said. Rode back through that storm route 3 times, asked in every town, every way station. No one knew anything. And then I came here to finalize a business deal, and I saw a woman shaking out a rug from a second-floor window. He smiled, small, almost sad, and I knew. Clara's hands trembled in her lap. Why didn't you say something? That night? Why did you leave? Because I didn't know how to stay. His voice was raw now, stripped of its careful control. I was wanted, Clara, not by the law, that warrant was a lie, but by men who don't forgive, men who would have burned this place to the ground to get to me. So I left, disappeared, spent every dollar I had left buying information, paying debts, clearing my name. He looked away. It took 5 months. But I did it. And the first thing I did when I was free was come back. For the hotel? For you? The words hung in the air between them, heavy and impossible. Clara stood slowly, her legs unsteady. I don't understand. I bought this place because I owed you a debt, Daniel said simply. You saved my life. And I don't know how to repay that except to make sure you never have to scrub floors or haul water or wonder if you'll have work tomorrow. This hotel is yours as much as it's mine now. You'll have a real wage, a real room, a say in how things are run." He paused. "If you want it." Clara stared at him, her mind reeling. Why? Because Mercy deserves more than silence. She didn't know what to say, didn't know if there were words big enough to hold what she was feeling, so she just stood there, tears finally spilling over, and let herself be seen. And Daniel Ashford, who had learned how to survive but never how to soften, took one step forward and did something he hadn't done in years. He offered his hand. Clara looked down at it, steady, open, waiting. Then she reached out and took it. Outside, the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the plains in shades of amber and rose. The wind moved through the grass, gentle now, carrying the smell of autumn and wood smoke. Inside the Lone Briar Hotel, lamps flickered to life one by one, and somewhere in the kitchen, Margaret hummed a tune she didn't know she remembered. The town kept moving, unaware that something had shifted, that two lives, tangled together by chance and snow and the quiet architecture of grace, had finally found their way back to each other, not with grand gestures or declarations, but with a handshake, shared silence, and the unspoken promise that some debts are worth more than money, some kindnesses, once given, rewrite the world, and some stories, no matter how far they wander, always find their way home. The morning came cold and gray, the sky heavy with clouds that promised rain but never delivered. Clara woke before dawn, as she always did, but this time she lay still for a moment, staring at the ceiling of her small room, her mind replaying the previous night over and over like a melody she couldn't shake. "This hotel is yours as much as it's mine now." The words felt impossible, too big, too generous. She'd spent 6 years learning to expect nothing, to take what was given and ask for no more. And now, she sat up slowly, pressing her hands to her face. Her fingers were cold, her palms damp. She didn't know how to hold something this fragile without breaking it. But the sun was rising, pale and thin through the window, and there was work to be done. There was always work to be done. Clara dressed quickly, pulling on her gray work dress, tying her kerchief tight. She washed her face in the basin, the water shockingly cold, then stepped out into the hallway. The hotel was silent, the guests still sleeping, the floorboards creaking softly under her boots. She made her way to the kitchen, expecting to find it empty. Instead, Margaret stood at the stove, her back rigid, her movements sharp and angry. She didn't turn when Clara entered. "Morning," Clara said quietly. Margaret slammed a pot down on the stovetop. "Is it?" Clara froze in the doorway. "Margaret, don't." Margaret spun around, her face flushed, her eyes hard. "Don't stand there and pretend like nothing's changed. I wasn't... You think I don't know?" Margaret's voice rose, trembling with something between anger and hurt. "You think the whole staff doesn't know? That he bought this place, and the first thing he did was ask for you?" Clara's stomach dropped. "It's not like that." "Then what's it like, Clara?" "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you've been keeping secrets. Looks like you knew he was coming. Looks like..." Margaret's voice cracked. "Looks like the rest of us don't matter anymore." "That's not true, isn't it?" Margaret crossed her arms, her expression bitter. "I've worked here 9 years. 9. And in one night, you go from scrubbing floors to, what, his personal attendant? His confidant? What did you do to earn that?" The accusation hung in the air like smoke. Clara felt the heat rise in her cheeks, shame and anger twisting together in her chest. "I didn't do anything." "Then why you?" "I don't know. Liar." The word cut deep. Clara took a step back, her hands shaking. "I'm not lying." "Then tell me the truth. Tell me why he looks at you like he knows you, why he asks for you by name, why he bought this whole damn place and the first person he speaks to is the maid." Margaret's eyes narrowed. "What did you do, Clara?" Clara's throat tightened. She wanted to explain. Wanted to tell Margaret about the storm, the stranger in the snow, the blanket and the revolver and the way Mercy had woven their lives together. But the words stuck in her throat, too fragile, too private. "I helped him once," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "That's all." Margaret stared at her for a long moment, then shook her head slowly. "I don't believe you." She turned back to the stove, her shoulders stiff, and Clara stood in the doorway frozen. Then she turned and walked away. The whisper started before breakfast. Clara felt them as she moved through the hotel, eyes following her, voices dropping to hushed murmurs when she passed. She carried linens down the hallway and heard the low buzz of conversation behind closed doors. She swept the parlor and caught the tail end of a sentence, heard she's been meeting him in secret, before the speakers noticed her and fell silent. By midday, the air inside the Lone Briar felt thick and poisonous. She was in the second-floor hallway, dusting the picture frames, when she heard footsteps behind her. She turned and found Mr. Garrett standing there, his hands clasped behind his back, his expression carefully neutral. "Densmore," he said. "A word." Clara set down her dusting cloth and followed him to the small office off the main lobby. He closed the door behind and gestured for her to sit. She did, her hands folded in her lap, her heart beating too fast. Mr. Garrett didn't sit. He stood by the window, looking out at the street, his jaw tight. "I'm not a fool, Densmore," he said finally. "I know how things look. I know what people are saying." Clara's throat tightened. "Sir, let me finish." He turned to face her. "I've known you 6 years. You've never given me reason to question your character. You've worked hard, kept to yourself, caused no trouble. So I want to hear it from you." He paused. "What's your relationship with Mr. Ashford?" Clara's hands tightened in her lap. "I saved his life. Last winter, during the storm. He was dying, and I brought him inside. That's all." "That's all?" "Yes, sir. And last night, when he asked to speak with you privately, he thanked me, offered me better wages, said I'd have a say in how the hotel's run." Clara met his gaze. "I didn't ask for any of it." Mr. Garrett studied her for a long moment. Then he sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. "I believe you, Densmore. I do. But it doesn't matter what I believe. It matters what they believe." He gestured vaguely toward the door, toward the hotel beyond. "People talk. They see a young woman elevated overnight, and they invent stories. Some of those stories will be cruel. Some will be dangerous. I haven't done anything wrong, I know. But perception is a powerful thing. And right now, the perception is that you've earned special favor through questionable means." He paused. "I'm not saying it's fair. I'm saying it's reality." Clara's chest tightened with anger. "So what do you want me to do? Apologize for helping someone? Pretend it didn't happen? I want you to be careful. Keep your head down. Do your work. And for God's sake, stay away from Mr. Ashford unless he specifically requests your presence." Mr. Garrett's voice softened. "I'm trying to protect you, Densmore, whether you believe that or not." Clara stood slowly, her legs unsteady. "May I go, sir?" He nodded, and she left without another word. The afternoon dragged on, heavy and oppressive. Clara worked in silence, her mind a storm of conflicting emotions, shame, anger, confusion. She'd done the right thing that night in the snow. She knew she had, but now it felt like punishment, like kindness itself had turned against her. She was in the laundry room, her hands raw from scrubbing, when she heard the door creak open behind her. She didn't turn. "Clara," Daniel's voice. She froze, her hands still in the soapy water. "I need to speak with you," he said quietly. "I'm working. It can wait." "I'd rather it didn't, sir." A pause. Then footsteps coming closer. "Don't do that." "Do what?" "Call me sir, like I'm a stranger." Clara finally turned, water dripping from her hands, her expression guarded. "Aren't you?" Daniel stood in the doorway, his coat removed, his shirt sleeves rolled up. He looked tired, she realized. The sharpness from yesterday was gone, replaced by something softer, more uncertain. "I heard what they're saying," he said. "About you, about us." "Then you know I can't be seen talking to you. That's exactly why I came to find you. This isn't fair to you. I didn't think—" He stopped, running a hand through his hair. "I should have been more careful. Should have known how it would look. It's done now, so we do nothing. Let them tear you apart with gossip." Clara's jaw tightened. "What would you have me do, Mr. Ashford? Stand in the parlor and explain to everyone that you're not my lover, just a man I saved from freezing to death? You think that'll stop the whispers? No, but I won't let you suffer for my mistakes. It's not your choice. The hell it isn't." His voice rose, then dropped again, controlled. "I came back here for a reason, Clara. I came back because I owed you a debt, and I won't walk away just because people are small-minded and cruel. Then what do you want from me?" The words came out sharper than she intended. "You want me to smile and nod and pretend everything's fine while they call me a whore behind my back? You want me to be grateful? I want you to let me fix this. You can't fix people, Daniel. The use of his name hung between them, unexpected and raw. Daniel stepped closer, his voice quiet now, almost pleading. Then tell me what to do. Clara stared at him, her heart aching. She wanted to tell him to leave, to sell the hotel and disappear again, to let her life return to what it was, small, quiet, invisible. But she couldn't, because the truth was, she didn't want him to go, and that terrified her more than any gossip ever could. I don't know, she whispered. For a long moment, neither of them moved. The laundry room felt too small, too warm, the air thick with words they couldn't say. Then, from somewhere in the hotel, a bell rang, sharp, urgent. They both turned toward the sound. Smoke. Clara smelled it before she saw it, acrid and thick, curling under the door. Daniel moved first, crossing the room in 2 strides and yanking the door open. Gray smoke billowed into the hallway, and somewhere in the distance, someone screamed. Fire, Daniel said, his voice sharp and steady. West Wing. Clara's training kicked in instantly. She grabbed a bucket of water and ran. The West Wing was chaos. Smoke poured from one of the guest rooms, thick and black, filling the hallway. Guests stumbled out of their rooms, coughing, their faces pale with fear. Clara pushed past them, her eyes streaming, her lungs burning. She could hear Daniel shouting behind her, directing people toward the stairs, his voice cutting through the panic. She reached the burning room and kicked the door open. Heat hit her like a wall, and for a moment she couldn't see anything, just flames crawling up the curtains, devouring the bedding, licking at the walls. Then she heard it. A voice, weak, terrified. Help! An old man sat hunched in the corner, trapped behind the flames, his hands covering his face. One of the guests, Mr. Brennan, the surveyor. He'd been staying in this room for a week. Clara didn't think. She threw the bucket of water at the base of the flames, creating a gap, then grabbed a blanket from the hallway and wrapped it around herself. She plunged through the smoke, her eyes shut tight, her breath held. Her hands found the old man's arm and she pulled. He was heavy, disoriented, but she dragged him anyway, step by agonizing step, back through the heat and smoke. Her lungs screamed, her skin burned, but she didn't let go. Then strong hands grabbed her shoulders and she was being pulled backward. Daniel, he'd come through the flames, after her, and now he lifted Mr. Brennan like he weighed nothing, hauling him out into the hallway. They collapsed in the corridor, coughing violently. Around them, other staff rushed forward with more water, beating at the flames with wet blankets. Slowly, agonizingly, the fire began to die. By the time it was out, the hallway was a ruin. Walls blackened, floor scorched, the smell of burnt wood and fabric thick in the air. But everyone was alive. Clara sat against the wall, her dress torn and soaked, her face streaked with soot. Her hands were blistered, her lungs raw. But she was breathing. Daniel knelt beside her, his own face blackened, his shirt singed. You're insane, he said, his voice hoarse. You could have died. Clara looked up at him, too exhausted to argue. So could he. Daniel stared at her for a long moment. Then, slowly, he reached out and brushed a strand of hair from her face. His hand was trembling. Why do you do that? He asked quietly. Do what? Risk everything for people you barely know. Clara thought about the question, thought about the stranger in the snow, the old man in the fire, all the small moments in her life when she'd chosen compassion over safety. Because someone has to, she said simply. Daniel's expression shifted, something breaking open behind his eyes, something that looked like awe and grief and understanding all at once. Then he did something she didn't expect. He leaned forward, resting his forehead against hers, his breath warm and unsteady. Clara Densmore, he whispered, you're going to be the death of me. She closed her eyes, her heart too full to speak, and in that moment, surrounded by smoke and ruin and the quiet hum of survival, something fundamental shifted between them. Not love, not yet, but the beginning of it. Fragile, fierce, forged in fire. By evening, the West Wing had been cordoned off, the damaged rooms sealed until repairs could be made. The guests had been relocated. Mr. Brennan checked by the doctor and found shaken but unharmed. The hotel slowly settled back into uneasy calm. Clara sat on the back steps, a blanket wrapped around her shoulders, staring out at the darkening plains. Her hands were bandaged, her dress ruined. She smelled like smoke and ash. but she was alive. Footsteps approached. She didn't need to look to know who it was. Daniel sat down beside her, close but not touching, his own hands wrapped in gauze. For a long time, neither of them spoke. They just sat there, watching the light fade, listening to the wind move through the grass. "They're still going to talk," Clara said finally. "I know. It'll be worse now. After today, probably." Clara turned to look at him. "Does it bother you, what they say?" Daniel met her gaze, his expression steady. "Only because it bothers you. That's not an answer." "Yes, it is." He looked away, his jaw tight. "I spent 5 months rebuilding my name, Clara, clearing my reputation, making sure the world saw me as something other than a wanted man. And now I'm here, and all I can think about is one woman who never asked who I was or what I'd done, who just helped." He paused. "So no, I don't care what they say, because they don't know what I know, and what's that? That mercy is worth more than reputation." The words settled between them, quiet and true. Clara pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders and leaned back, her head resting against the wooden post. Above them, the first stars were beginning to appear, faint and distant. "I'm tired, Daniel," she said softly. "I know. I don't know if I can keep doing this. The whispers, the judgment, the waiting for the next disaster. You don't have to do it alone." She looked at him, her eyes stinging with tears she refused to shed. "Yes, I do. That's what I've always done. Not anymore." Daniel reached out, his bandaged hand finding hers, holding it gently. "I'm not leaving, Clara. Not this time. Not ever. So whatever comes next, we face it together." Clara stared down at their joined hands, the bandages stark white in the growing darkness. She wanted to believe him, wanted to let herself hope that, maybe, just maybe, the world could be kinder than she'd learned to expect. But hope was a dangerous thing, and she'd been burned enough for one lifetime. Still, she didn't pull her hand away. And as the night deepened, and the stars multiplied overhead, filling the vast Wyoming sky with light, 2 people sat side by side on the back steps of the Lone Briar Hotel. Not speaking, not moving, just holding on. While the ash settled around them, and somewhere in the darkness, beyond the reach of lamplight and gossip and fear, something ancient stirred. A truth the world had forgotten. That kindness, once planted, grows roots too deep to burn, and mercy, no matter how small, always finds a way to bloom, even in the hardest soil. Even after the fire. The morning after the fire dawned clear and cold, the sky a pale blue that stretched forever. Clara woke to pain, her hands throbbing beneath the bandages, her lungs still raw from smoke. She lay in her cot for a long moment, staring at the ceiling, listening to the sounds of the hotel waking around her. Footsteps in the hallway, voices muted through walls, the distant clatter of pots in the kitchen. Everything felt different now, heavier, like the air itself had changed composition. She dressed slowly, her bandaged hands clumsy with buttons and laces. When she finally emerged from her room, the hallway was empty except for pale morning light slanting through the windows. She made her way toward the kitchen, moving carefully, each step measured. Margaret was already there, kneading dough with fierce concentration. She looked up when Clara entered, and for a moment their eyes met. Something passed between them, not forgiveness exactly, but a crack in the wall. Margaret's gaze dropped to Clara's bandaged hands, and her expression softened almost imperceptibly. "You should be resting," Margaret said quietly. "So should you." Margaret almost smiled. Almost. Then she turned back to the dough. "There's coffee on the stove, made it strong." Clara poured herself a cup, the heat seeping through the ceramic into her sore palms. She stood by the window, watching the street slowly come to life. A wagon rattled past. A dog barked in the distance. Ordinary morning sounds in an ordinary town, except nothing felt ordinary anymore. "Clara," she turned. Margaret had stopped kneading, her flour-dusted hands resting on the counter. "What you did yesterday," Margaret said, not meeting her eyes. "With Mr. Brennan. That took courage." Clara didn't know what to say. She just nodded. Margaret took a breath, then continued. "I said some things. About you and Mr. Ashford. Things I shouldn't have said. You were hurt. Doesn't make it right." Margaret finally looked up, her eyes red-rimmed and tired. "I've been here 9 years, and I let jealousy turn me cruel. That's not who I want to be." Clara crossed the room slowly and set down her coffee. I should have told you. About him, about what happened last winter. I kept it secret because I didn't know how to explain it. But that wasn't fair to you. Would I have believed? You. Clara smiled faintly. Probably not. For a moment they just stood there, two women worn down by work and worry and the weight of trying to survive in a world that gave them little mercy. Then Margaret wiped her hands on her apron and extended one toward Clara. Truce? Clara took it carefully, mindful of her bandages. Truce. By mid-morning, the news had spread beyond the hotel. Clara was sweeping the front porch when she saw them coming. A small group of men on horseback, riding slowly down the main street. 6 of them, maybe 7, their coats dusty, their faces hard. They moved with the kind of deliberate calm that made her stomach tighten. One rider led the group, a star pinned to his vest catching the sunlight. The sheriff. Clara set down her broom and stepped back toward the door, her heart beginning to race. Behind her, she heard footsteps, and Daniel emerged from inside, his expression immediately alert. Stay inside, he said quietly. What's happening? I don't know yet. He moved past her, descending the porch steps as the riders approached. Clara ignored his instruction and followed, staying just behind him. The sheriff dismounted first, a tall man with graying hair and a face carved from hard experience. He hooked his thumbs in his belt and surveyed Daniel with cool appraisal. You Daniel Ashford? I am. The sheriff nodded slowly. Name's Hayes, Sheriff Hayes. Got some business with you. What kind of business? Hayes reached into his coat and pulled out a folded document, yellowed with age and wear. He opened it carefully, and Clara's blood went cold. It was a wanted poster. The face drawn on it was younger, rougher, the beard heavier, but unmistakable, Daniel's face. And beneath it, in bold letters, wanted for murder, $500 reward. This is you, isn't it? Hayes said quietly. Daniel's jaw tightened, but his voice remained steady. That warrant's been cleared. 5 months ago. Charges dropped, name expunged. Whoever gave you that information is working from old records. Maybe so, but I got a wire 3 days ago from a marshal in Cheyenne saying you might be in this area. Said there's men looking for you. Said the warrant might have been cleared officially, but there's folks who don't care much about official. Hayes refolded the poster. So I'm asking you straight, is there a reason men with guns might come looking for you? Daniel's silence was answer enough. Clara felt her chest constrict. She looked at the men on horseback, their hands resting near their pistols, their eyes cold and watchful. Then she looked at Daniel, standing perfectly still, his shoulders squared. There was a misunderstanding, Daniel said finally. Years ago, I was accused of killing a man in a dispute over stolen goods. I didn't do it, but I ran instead of fighting the charge. That made me look guilty. The real killer confessed, on his deathbed 2 years later, and the warrant was voided. But the men who wanted you dead don't care about deathbed confessions. No, they don't, Hayes nodded slowly. How many? I don't know. Could be 2, could be 10. The man I was accused of killing had brothers. Associates. They've been hunting me for 6 years. Daniel's voice was flat, matter-of-fact. I paid my debts, cleared my name, built a new life. But some men don't let grudges die, and you brought that here, to this town. I didn't think they'd find me. Men like that always find what they're looking for. Hayes glanced toward the hotel, then back at Daniel. I got families in this town. Children. Decent people trying to live quiet lives. I won't have a range war start because you wanted to hide here. I'm not hiding. Then what are you doing? Daniel's gaze flicked to Clara just for a second, then back to Hayes. I'm trying to live. The words hung in the air, simple and defiant. Hayes studied him for a long moment. Then he sighed, his expression softening just a fraction. I believe you, Ashford. I do. But belief doesn't stop bullets. He gestured to his men. I'm posting guards around town. Anyone comes through looking like trouble will intercept them. But if shooting starts, you're on your own. Understood? Understood. Hayes remounted his horse, then paused, looking down at Daniel. One more thing. The man who sent me that wire, he said you were traveling with a woman. Someone who helped you when you had nothing. His gaze shifted to Clara. That her? Daniel's hands clenched at his sides. Leave her out of this. Can't do that if she's already in it. Clara stepped forward before Daniel could stop her. I'm Clara Densmore. I work here, and yes, I helped him. Last winter. He would have died otherwise. Hayes looked at her for a long moment, something like respect flickering in his eyes. You know what you've gotten yourself into, Miss Densmore? I didn't know it would come to this. Would it have mattered? Clara thought about the stranger in the snow, the way his breath had rattled in his chest, the choice she'd made without thinking, without weighing consequences. No, she said quietly, it wouldn't have. Hayes almost smiled, figured as much. He tipped his hat. Stay safe, Miss Densmore. And you, Ashford, if trouble comes, you face it outside town limits. Don't make me choose between law and mercy. Then he turned his horse and rode away, his men following, leaving nothing but dust and the heavy weight of inevitability. The hotel emptied within hours. Guests who'd planned to stay another week suddenly had urgent business elsewhere. The widow and her daughters left on the noon stage. The railway men packed their bags and rode out before sundown. By evening, the Lone Briar was nearly deserted. Just the permanent staff and a handful of travelers, too stubborn or too poor to leave. Clara stood in the dining hall, staring at the empty tables, her heart hollow. Daniel found her there as dusk settled over the plains. He stood in the doorway, his face drawn, his eyes shadowed with guilt. I'm sorry, he said. Clara didn't turn. For what? For bringing this here, for putting you in danger. For, his voice broke slightly, for being selfish enough to come back. You're not selfish. Yes, I am. He moved into the room, stopping a few feet away. I should have stayed gone, should have left you in peace, but I couldn't. And now what? Clara finally turned to face him. Now you're going to run again? Disappear? Let those men win? If it keeps you safe. I don't want safe. The words came out fiercer than she intended. I've spent my whole life being safe, Daniel, keeping my head down, not making waves. And you know what that got me? 6 years scrubbing floors in a place where nobody knew my name. She took a step closer. You came back, you remembered. You saw me, and for the first time in longer than I can remember, I felt like I mattered. So don't you dare apologize for that. Daniel stared at her, something breaking open in his expression. Clara, I'm not done. She closed the distance between them. Those men are coming, whether you stay or leave. And if they come, I'd rather stand beside someone I believe in than hide alone and pretend I'm safe. You could die. So could you. That's different. No, it's not. Clara's voice softened. You pulled yourself out of nothing, Daniel. Built a life from ash and lies in the stubborn belief that you deserved better. That's not selfish. That's brave. And I won't let you throw it away because you're afraid. Daniel reached out slowly, his hands framing her face, his thumbs brushing against her cheekbones. His touch was gentle, reverent, like she was something precious he was afraid to break. I don't deserve you, he whispered. Maybe not, but you're stuck with me anyway. And then, in the empty dining hall with darkness falling outside and danger gathering on the horizon, Daniel Ashford kissed Clara Densmore. It wasn't desperate or hurried. It was slow, deliberate, full of everything they couldn't say. A promise, a plea, a quiet declaration that some things were worth fighting for. When they finally pulled apart, both breathless, Clara rested her forehead against his. We'll face this together, she said. Together, he echoed. The men arrived 2 days later. Clara saw the dust first, 3 columns rising on the eastern road, moving fast. She was in the upstairs hallway when she noticed them, and her stomach dropped. She ran to find Daniel, her boots loud on the stairs. He was in the parlor, reviewing ledgers. He looked up when she burst in, and the expression on her face told him everything. They're here, Clara said. Daniel stood slowly, setting the ledgers aside. His face was calm, but his eyes burned with something fierce and unyielding. How many? 3 riders, maybe more behind them. He nodded, then crossed to the corner where he'd left his gun belt. He strapped it on with practiced efficiency, checking the chambers, his movements precise. Daniel, stay inside, lock the doors, no matter what you hear, don't come out. I'm not hiding while you... Clara. He turned, gripping her shoulders. Please, I need to know you're safe. That's the only way I can do this. She wanted to argue, wanted to stand beside him, face whatever came. But she saw the fear in his eyes, not for himself but for her, and she nodded. Be careful, always am. He kissed her once, hard and fast, then walked out the front door. Clara ran to the window, pressing her face against the glass. Outside, Daniel stood in the center of the street, his hand resting on his pistol, his posture relaxed but ready. The dust cloud grew closer, resolving into shapes. 3 riders, then 5, then 7. They stopped 20 feet from Daniel, forming a loose semicircle. The man in the center was broad-shouldered and grim-faced, with a scar running from his temple to his jaw. He dismounted slowly, his hand near his gun. "Daniel Ashford," the man said, his voice carrying clearly through the still air. "Colton." Daniel's voice was steady. "Been a while. 6 years." Colton spat in the dirt. "6 years I've been looking for you. 6 years wondering where you crawled off to die. I didn't die, no. But you will." Colton gestured to the men behind him. "My brother's blood demands it. Your brother was killed by Marcus Hale. He confessed before he died. The law cleared me. The law." Colton's laugh was bitter. "The law don't bring him back. Don't make my mother stop crying. Don't make any of this right, so you'll kill me. Then what? Will that bring him back? Will that make it right?" Colton's hand moved toward his gun. "It'll be a start." Time slowed. Clara saw Daniel's hand twitch toward his holster, saw Colton's fingers wrap around his pistol grip, saw the other men shifting, ready to draw, and then, "Stop!" Clara's voice rang out clear and strong. She stepped through the front door of the hotel onto the porch, her hands raised. Every eye turned to her. "Clara, get back inside," Daniel said, his voice tight with fear. She ignored him. She walked down the steps, slow and steady, until she stood beside Daniel in the middle of the street. "Who the hell are you?" Colton demanded. "My name is Clara Densmore, and I'm the woman who saved this man's life." Colton's eyes narrowed. "That's supposed to mean something to me?" "It means you're not the only one with a stake in whether he lives or dies." Clara's voice was calm, but her heart hammered against her ribs. "You want justice for your brother. I understand that. But killing Daniel won't give you justice. It'll just make you a murderer too. He killed my brother." "No, he didn't. And you know it. Marcus Hale confessed. The law cleared him. But you don't care about truth, do you? You just want someone to bleed." Colton's jaw clenched. "You don't know anything about it, you're right. I don't know what it's like to lose a brother. But I know what it's like to survive. To scrape together a life from nothing. To wake up every day and choose to keep going even when the world tells you you're worthless." She took a step forward. Daniel did that. He cleared his name, built something from ash. And if you kill him now, you're not avenging your brother. You're just proving that mercy and redemption don't matter. That once a man's accused, he's guilty forever. Colton stared at her, his hand still on his gun. "Why do you care?" "Because he came back." Clara's voice broke slightly. He didn't have to. He'd escaped. He'd built a new life. But he came back because he owed me a debt, because he believed kindness was worth repaying. She looked at Colton, her eyes fierce. "If you kill him, you're not just killing a man. You're killing the idea that people can change, that mercy matters, that the world can be better than it is." Silence stretched across the street. The wind moved through the grass, whispering. Somewhere, a crow called. The men on horseback shifted uneasily. Then Colton's hand moved away from his gun. He stared at Daniel for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he turned to Clara. "You believe he's innocent? I know he is. And if I leave him alive, what's to stop him from running again? From disappearing? I am." Clara reached out and took Daniel's hand, lacing her fingers through his. "He's not running anymore. He's staying here, with me. And if you want to kill him, you'll have to go through me first." Colton looked between them, something shifting in his face. Grief, maybe. Or exhaustion. The weight of carrying hate for too long. Finally, he nodded. "I hope you're right about him, Miss Densmore. For both your sakes." He mounted his horse, and his men followed suit. They turned and rode away slowly, the dust rising behind them like smoke. Clara and Daniel stood in the street, still holding hands, watching until the riders disappeared over the horizon. Then Daniel turned to her, his eyes bright with unshed tears. "You're the bravest person I've ever met." Clara laughed, shaky and relieved. "I'm terrified." "Good. That makes 2 of us." He pulled her close, wrapping his arms around her, and she buried her face in his chest, breathing in the smell of dust and gunpowder and survival. Around them, the town slowly came back to life. Doors opened. People emerged. And in the dining hall window, Margaret stood watching, a small smile on her face. The sheriff rode up a few minutes later, his expression tight. They gone? They're gone, Daniel said. Hayes looked at Clara, then at Daniel, then shook his head slowly. Don't know what you said to Colton, Miss Densmore, but you just saved this town from a bloodbath. I just told the truth. Well, Hayes tipped his hat. Sometimes that's all it takes. That night, the Lone Briar Hotel filled again. Not with guests, but with townspeople. They came bearing food, lanterns, chairs pulled from their own homes. They filled the parlor and dining hall, and someone brought a fiddle, and music drifted through the open windows. It wasn't a celebration exactly, more like a collective exhale, a recognition that they'd all survived something together. Clara stood in the kitchen, washing dishes, when Daniel found her. He leaned against the doorframe, watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. What? She asked. Nothing. Just memorizing this. Memorizing what? You. Here. Safe. He crossed the room and took her hands, still damp from dishwater. I love you, Clara Densmore. The words landed soft and sure, and Clara felt her breath catch. You don't have to say it back, Daniel continued. I just needed you to know. Needed you to hear it. Clara looked up at him. This man who'd appeared in a storm and disappeared into legend and come back owning the world she'd thought would never be hers. I love you too, she whispered. And when he kissed her this time, it tasted like redemption, like mercy finally coming home. Outside, the music played on and the stars wheeled overhead, and the plains stretched away into darkness. But inside the Lone Briar Hotel, warmth blazed against the night. And two people who'd been lost found themselves at last, together, whole, redeemed by the oldest law of all. That kindness, once planted, grows roots strong enough to hold the world. Autumn arrived gently that year, slipping over the plains like a whisper. The grass turned from green to gold, then deepened to amber and bronze. The air carried the smell of wood smoke and ripe apples from the small orchard behind the hotel. Mornings came cool and clear, the sky so blue it almost hurt to look at, and the light had a softness to it now, a warmth that made everything seem gentler, kinder. Clara woke early, as she always did, but now she took her time. No rushing, no anxious counting of tasks ahead. She dressed in a simple calico dress, blue with small white flowers, and tied her hair back loosely. When she looked at herself in the small mirror above her wash basin, she barely recognized the woman staring back. There were still lines around her eyes, still calluses on her hands. But something had changed, something in the way she held herself, the way her shoulders no longer curved inward, protective, the way her mouth rested naturally in something close to a smile. She looked like someone who'd been given permission to hope. And maybe, she thought as she pinned a small brooch to her collar, a gift from Daniel, simple silver in the shape of a wildflower, maybe that's exactly what she was. The Lone Briar Hotel had transformed over the months since the standoff in the street, not in grand sweeping ways, but in small, essential ones. The west wing had been repaired, the walls repainted a warm cream color. New curtains hung in the windows, deep red, the color of wine. The front porch had been rebuilt, wider now, with 2 rocking chairs positioned to catch the afternoon sun. But it was more than the physical changes. There was a different feeling to the place now, a sense of belonging, of safety. The guests who came through stayed longer, families with children who ran laughing through the halls, elderly couples who sat in the parlor playing chess, traveling musicians who filled the dining room with songs on Saturday nights. The hotel had become more than just a place to sleep. It had become a home for people passing through, a refuge from the harshness of the frontier. And Clara, who had spent so many years invisible, was now at the center of it all. Not as a maid, not anymore. Daniel had been true to his word. She managed the guest rooms now, supervised the housekeeping, greeted travelers at the front desk. She had her own small office, just a converted storage room really, but it had a window and a desk and her name painted on the door in neat gold letters. Clara Densmore, Guest Services. Some mornings she still couldn't believe it was real. She found Daniel in the garden behind the hotel, kneeling in the dirt beside a row of late-season vegetables. He'd rolled his shirt sleeves to his elbows, and his hands were dark with soil. She watched him from the doorway for a moment, smiling at the sight. Daniel Ashford, businessman and former outlaw, pulling carrots like a farmer. "You're going to ruin that shirt," she called out. He looked up, grinning. "It's already ruined. This is the 3rd time this week. Maybe you should buy clothes specifically for gardening. Where's the fun in that?" He stood, brushing dirt from his knees, and walked over to where she stood. Even after months, The sight of him still made her heart skip, the easy confidence in his stride, the way his eyes softened when they landed on her. Morning, morning. She reached up and brushed a smudge of dirt from his cheek. You're a mess. You love it. I tolerate it. He laughed and kissed her, quick and warm, tasting like coffee in autumn air. What's on the schedule today? We have a family arriving this afternoon from Omaha, the Carters. 3 children under 10, so I put them in the south wing where they won't disturb the other guests. Clara pulled a small notebook from her pocket, flipping through the pages. Mrs. Patterson in room 4 needs fresh linens. Mr. Whitmore's extended his stay another week, and Margaret wants to know if you're serious about adding a second oven to the kitchen. Tell Margaret she can have whatever she needs. The kitchen's her domain. Daniel glanced back at the garden, then at Clara. And tell her I'll be in after lunch to discuss it. Right now, I have more important business. More important than the hotel? Much more important. He took her hand and pulled her gently toward the rows of vegetables. I need help deciding which pumpkins to keep for carving and which to give to Margaret for pies. Clara let herself be led, laughing. This is not important business. Shows what you know. Pumpkin selection is an art form. They spent the next hour in the garden, debating the merits of various squashes, pulling the last of the tomatoes, discussing whether to plant more herbs come spring. It was mundane work, the kind Clara had done 1,000 times in her life, but doing it beside Daniel, with the sun warm on her shoulders and his laughter filling the air. It felt like something else entirely. It felt like building a life. By afternoon, the hotel buzzed with quiet activity. The Carter family had arrived as scheduled, a harried mother, a patient father, and 3 tow-headed children who immediately began exploring every corner of the building with wide-eyed wonder. Clara showed them to their rooms, arranged for extra blankets, and promised the children she'd save them cookies from that evening's supper. She was crossing through the main parlor when she noticed someone she didn't recognize sitting in one of the wing-back chairs near the fireplace. An older woman, perhaps 70, with silver hair pinned up elegantly and a black traveling dress that spoke of both quality and age. She held a teacup delicately, her posture perfect, her gaze distant. Clara approached slowly. Good afternoon, I'm Clara Densmore. Can I help you with anything? The woman looked up, and her eyes, pale blue, still sharp, focused on Clara with unexpected intensity. You're her... Clara blinked. I'm sorry. The woman from the story, the one who saved the stranger in the snow. The woman set down her teacup carefully. My grandson told me about it. About the woman who risked everything to help a dying man she'd never met. Clara felt her cheeks warm. It wasn't that dramatic, ma'am, wasn't it? The woman smiled slightly. My name is Elizabeth Brennan. I'm William Brennan's mother, the man you pulled from the fire. Clara's breath caught. Is Mr. Brennan all right? He's fine, back in Boston, complaining about his doctors and refusing to take his medicine. Typical William. Elizabeth's expression softened. But he's alive. Because of you. And when he wrote to tell me what happened, I knew I had to come and see for myself, the kind of woman who runs into burning buildings for strangers. I didn't think. I just acted. Elizabeth nodded. That's what courage is, my dear. Not the absence of fear, but the refusal to let fear make your decisions. She reached into her reticule and pulled out an envelope, offering it to Clara. William wanted me to give you this. Clara took it hesitantly, feeling the weight of paper inside. What is it? Open it. Clara carefully opened the envelope and pulled out a single sheet of paper. It was a banknote. For $500. She nearly dropped it. I can't accept this. You can, and you will. William is a wealthy man, Miss Densmore. That amount means nothing to him, and everything to you. Consider it a thank you, or an investment in goodness if that sits easier. Elizabeth stood, smoothing her skirts. The world is full of people who look away, my dear. Who tell themselves it's not their problem, not their responsibility. But you looked, you acted, you cared. That deserves recognition. Clara stared at the banknote, her vision blurring with tears. $500, more money than she'd made in 3 years of scrubbing floors. I don't know what to say. Say you'll keep being exactly who you are. Elizabeth placed a gentle hand on Clara's cheek. The world needs more women like you. Then she gathered her things and swept out of the parlor, leaving Clara standing alone with the banknote trembling in her hands. That evening, Clara sat on the front porch in one of the new rocking chairs, watching the sun sink toward the horizon. The sky was on fire, oranges and pinks and deep purples bleeding into each other like watercolors. The plains stretched away in every direction, peaceful and vast. Daniel found her there and settled into the chair beside her without a word. They rocked in comfortable silence, the wood creaking softly beneath them. "Elizabeth Brennan came by today," Clara said finally. "I heard—" "Margaret said she was asking about you." Clara pulled the banknote from her pocket and handed it to him. Daniel looked at it, his eyebrows rising, then handed it back. "That's yours." "I know, but I don't know what to do with it." "What do you want to do with it?" Clara thought for a long moment, watching the light fade. "Save it, maybe. For something important. Something that matters. Sounds wise. Or maybe—" She trailed off, then started again. "There's a girl who comes by the kitchen sometimes. Sarah. She's maybe 8 years old, lives with her aunt on the edge of town. Her parents died last year and the aunt works at the general store for almost nothing. Sarah's smart, curious, but she'll never go to school because the aunt can't afford it." Daniel turned to look at her. "You want to pay for her schooling, and maybe others like her, if there are more." Clara's voice was quiet but firm. "I spent so many years with nothing, Daniel. Invisible, powerless. And now I have something, not just money, but a voice, a place. And I want to use it for something good." Daniel reached over and took her hand, lacing their fingers together. "Then that's what we'll do. You think I'm letting you do this alone? I'm the one who taught you to be recklessly generous." He smiled. "We'll start a fund. For children who need schooling, for families who need help, we'll call it." He paused, thinking. "The Kindness Fund." Clara laughed, the sound bright and free. "That's terrible. It's perfect." He brought her hand to his lips and kissed her knuckles. "And it's very us." They sat together as darkness fell, the sky deepening from purple to indigo to black. Stars began to appear, one by one, until the heavens were full of light. "Daniel," Clara said softly, "are you happy?" He was quiet for a moment. Then, "I didn't think I knew how to be. For so many years I was just surviving, running, building walls. And then, you happened. And you taught me that happiness isn't something you achieve or earn or fight for. It's something you choose every single day." He turned to look at her, his eyes reflecting starlight. "So yes, I'm happy. More than I ever thought possible." Clara felt tears slip down her cheeks, warm and unbidden. "Me too." The weeks that followed were full of small joys. The Carter children running through the hallways. Margaret's new oven producing bread that smelled like heaven itself. Mr. Whitmore finally winning a chess match against the traveling minister who'd been beating him for 3 weeks straight. Sarah's face when Clara told her about the schooling fund. The way the little girl had thrown her arms around Clara's waist and held on like she'd never let go. Life at the Lone Briar settled into a rhythm that felt almost musical. Mornings with coffee and quiet conversation. Afternoons full of work and laughter. Evenings on the porch, watching the light change. And through it all, Clara and Daniel moved together like partners in a dance they'd been rehearsing, their whole lives without knowing it. One night in late October, Clara was in her small office, reviewing the week's accounts, when Daniel appeared in the doorway. "Come with me," he said. "I'm working. It can wait." Something in his voice made her set down her pen. She followed him through the quiet hotel, out the back door, into the garden. The moon was full, turning everything silver and black. He led her to a small clearing where he'd been working earlier that week, supposedly planting bulbs for spring. But now there was something else there. A bench, simple, wooden, freshly built, and carved into the backrest, in letters that caught the moonlight, for Clara, who taught me that mercy is the bravest thing. Clara's hand went to her mouth. "Daniel, I made it myself. Probably not very good carpentry, but—" She kissed him, cutting off his words, pouring everything she felt into that single moment. When they finally pulled apart, both breathless, she pressed her forehead to his. "It's perfect." They sat together on the bench, wrapped in Daniel's coat, watching the moon climb higher. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called. The wind moved through the dry grass, whispering ancient secrets. "Do you ever think about that night?" Clara asked. "The storm? Every day. Do you think, if it hadn't happened, we would have found each other anyway?" Daniel was quiet for a long time. Then, "I don't know. Maybe, maybe not." but I like to think the world has a way of bringing together the people who need each other most." He pulled her closer. "We saved each other, Clara. You pulled me out of the snow and I pulled you out of invisibility. And now here we are." "Here we are," she echoed. Winter came again, but gently this time. The first snow fell on a quiet morning in early November, soft and clean, turning the world into something new. Clara stood at the window of the main parlor, watching it accumulate on the porch railing, on the garden bench, on the vast empty plains beyond. She thought about the woman she'd been a year ago, tired, invisible, afraid to hope for anything beyond survival. And she thought about the woman she was now. Still tired sometimes, yes. Still carrying the weight of hard years. But no longer invisible. No longer afraid. Behind her, the hotel hummed with life. Children's laughter from the south wing, the clatter of dishes from the kitchen, Margaret singing tunelessly as she worked, the low murmur of conversation from the parlor, and beside her, Daniel's reflection in the glass as he crossed the room to stand at her shoulder. "Beautiful, isn't it?" he said quietly. "Yes, reminds me of the night we met." Clara turned to look at him. "That was the worst night of my life, and the best night of mine." She smiled, reaching up to touch his face. "How does that work?" "I don't know, but I'm grateful for it." He covered her hand with his, for all of it, the storm, the fear, the running, because it led me here, to you, to this. Outside, the snow kept falling, soft and endless. Inside, the fire crackled in the hearth, and somewhere someone started playing a piano, slow, sweet notes that floated through the air like blessings. Clara leaned into Daniel, his arm coming around her shoulders, and watched the world transform. She thought about Mercy, about the small choice she'd made to step into a storm for a dying stranger, about how that single moment of compassion had rewritten both their lives, had rippled outward in ways she never could have imagined, and she understood, finally, that kindness was never small. It was a seed planted in hard ground, growing roots that reached deeper than anyone could see. It was the first crack in winter ice, letting spring water flow. It was the spark that became a fire, the fire that became warmth, the warmth that became home. It was everything. "Daniel," she said softly. Thank you." "For what?" "For coming back." He kissed the top of her head, his voice rough with emotion. "Thank you for not letting me freeze to death in a blizzard." She laughed, the sound bright and free, and he laughed too, and for a moment the whole hotel seemed to laugh with them. Joyful, alive, full of the stubborn, miraculous persistence of hope. Spring came eventually, as it always did. The snow melted. The bulbs Daniel had planted broke through the earth, unfurling green shoots that would soon become crocuses and tulips. The plains turned green again, vast and rolling, and the sky stretched overhead, infinite and blue. The Lone Briar Hotel stood solid against the horizon, smoke rising from its chimneys, lamplight glowing warm in its windows. Travelers came and went, each carrying away a small piece of the peace they'd found there. Children played in the garden. Margaret's pies won a ribbon at the county fair. Sarah started school and came by every Sunday to tell Clara everything she'd learned. And in the evenings, when the work was done and the guests were settled, Clara and Daniel sat together on the bench in the garden. Sometimes they talked. Sometimes they just sat in comfortable silence, listening to the wind and the distant sound of music from inside. The old blanket, the one Clara had wrapped around a dying stranger on the coldest night of winter, hung now over the back of the sofa in the main parlor. Guests often commented on it, asked about its history, and Clara would smile and say only that it had kept someone warm once, when warmth mattered most. She never told the full story. That was hers and Daniel's alone, their beginning, their secret. The moment when mercy and fate and the stubborn refusal to look away had intersected and changed everything. But sometimes, on nights when the fire burned low and the hotel was quiet, she'd take the blanket down and hold it, feel its weight, remember, and she'd think, this is where it started, this is where kindness took root, and look where it had grown, into a life, a home, a love, into proof that the smallest acts of compassion could reshape the world. Years later, when Clara was older, and her hair had gone silver, and her hands finally learned to rest, people would ask her about the Lone Briar Hotel, about how it became a haven in the hardest territory, about the woman who ran it with grace and the man who'd built it from nothing. And she would smile, that gentle smile that held 1,000 stories, and say simply, it started with a storm, and a choice, and the belief that mercy matters more than safety. And that, in the end, was enough, because the warm light had returned, not in grand gestures or dramatic revelations, but in the quiet, steady glow of two people who'd found each other in the darkness and refused to let go. In the laughter of children playing in sunlit rooms, in the smell of bread baking and coffee brewing, in the way travelers felt safer the moment they stepped through the door, in the legacy of kindness that spread outward like ripples on still water, touching lives they'd never know. The storm had passed, the snow had melted, and what remained was warmth, simple, enduring, true, the kind of warmth that comes not from fire or sun, but from human hearts that choose again and again to see each other's worth, to offer shelter when the world is cold, to believe in redemption when the past is dark, to plant seeds of grace in frozen ground and wait patiently for spring. And when spring came, as it always did, the whole world bloomed. Outside, the prairie wind moved through the fields, gentle now, carrying the scent of wild grass and possibility. The sun dipped toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose. And in the distance, a lone rider appeared on the road, not running this time, but coming home, because the Lone Briar Hotel, with its warm lights and open doors and the legacy of a woman who once shared her blanket with a stranger, had become more than just a building. It had become a promise that kindness endures, that mercy redeems, that the smallest acts of love can change everything, and that sometimes, if you're very lucky, the warmth you give away comes back to you, multiplied, made whole, forever.